I've seen with atheists over the years. And I have vocalized this on a number of occasions. And a lot of times it's completely ignored, as if I didn't even say it. And it's this idea that among atheists there's a view that all religions, all of them, even the ones they probably don't know a damn thing about, conform to their ideals of the Abrahamic religions, and most specifically Christianity and Islam. If you present religious ideas from the East, for instance, like Buddhism or Hinduism, or classical religions like that of ancient Greece or Egypt or the Norse or the Celts, just pretty much any other religions that are not Christianity and Islam, they immediately try to find a way in which those religions conform to the idea that all religions are absolutist in orientation, that they're looking for absolute truths, that they're dogmatic, that they're ecclesiastical, that they're proselytizing, and many of them are not. Most of the ones that have existed on the planet are not, like Christianity and Islam. If they're extremely influential, obviously, and they've spread very, very quickly in the span of human history, a fairly short period of time. But they're not willing to look at religious beliefs objectively. They're not willing to look at them as being other things. Atheists just see them as a problem, and they've constructed a narrative around that problem and characterized them based on the experiences they've probably had growing up and being exposed to. And since atheism as a movement is largely through developed countries and through the West, as it were, it's through the lens of their Christian upbringing. It's usually always Christian. So I think that's very disingenuous, and it's very difficult to have a conversation with somebody who's already come to that conclusion. And it's even more insulting when they have this bias, when they have a clear, fallacious argument that they're presenting on the nature of religion, and yet they use the same argument that other people's, that religious beliefs are fallacious and that they are developed around or because of a bias. Or they say, oh, no ad hominems, yet they feel entirely justified to use ad hominems. And you see these same kinds of ideas among social justice warriors, among people who are radicalists or for whatever social cause from a very leftist and also from a very right-leaning perspective. It seems the more extreme people are, the more they'll use these terms but think that their particular in-group is an exception to their rule.
And why do you suppose that is, Kevin? I mean, what would be your educated guess as to, or educated hypothesis as to why such behavior exists with this group?
They're wounded emotionally, psychologically, and they can't see straight.
That is true in a lot of levels for almost everyone. All of us are wounded in some way, shape, or form. And what really is happening here too is that there's something called a confirmation bias that they also that people fall into, and that we look for things to confirm our suspicions and to confirm our thoughts about a particular topic, whether it's negative or positive. And so it's like, sure, this trait that you experience that you just announced is not just, as you know, I would hope, it's not just atheists. It's everyone. We all do it. We all find some way to do it in some way, shape, or form. And whether or not it's good or it's certainly counterproductive to me trying to achieve an intellectual detente to some type of a common ground. But it happens with everyone. It's not just the atheists who do it, but there's a reason why they do it. And that's because it's a way to feel like they're in a group and they've got someone to be with. Just a completely primal reason. And I think that once we start realizing how things primal are effective, we can better know how to address it and not be so affected by it.
I do agree with you that a level of that kind of emotional bias is present in everybody on some level. But there's two groups that do that on a level that is infringing on a person's rights of privacy, rights to be treated like a human being. That I see more with Abrahamic religions and with atheists than I see with everyone else of almost any other ideological position. And I've actually seen it more with atheists, honestly. I'll get into a conversation with a really religious Christian. I establish that my belief is not like theirs, and that it's one that's well studied and based on my personal experience, and I usually back down. But I've been atheists who will try to drag me into a debate for 3 hours. And they try to attack my character. They try to attack everything about me. And what their arguments usually boil down to, the thing that's levied against even just people who are spiritual, they don't necessarily have a religious belief in the ways that you might conventionally understand it. The thing that's levied against people who are basically not atheists, by atheists, is you are either stupid, mentally ill, or both. Flat out. I've heard that repeated over and over and over again, to the point that I've wanted to strangle some of these people I've been talking to.
Oh, dude, seriously, Kevin, I hear you. Not manipulating, not handling you. I understand it. But the fact of the matter is, when you feel like you want to strangle them because of the way they are, you're letting them get to you. And you're letting them manipulate you and change you and become something that's very much like them. And that's when the problem starts.
The problem is not me. The problem is that they are being dicks. I shouldn't have to debate with somebody that I don't want to debate with. They try to force a debate because of their own bias.
All you have to do
I'm very clear.
All you have to do is stop talking to them. You don't have to continue talking to them. Once you've made your point clear,
the thing is, when you're
argumentative, then at that point you just go, okay, I've said all I have to say and I'm done.
And that's what I usually do. That is absolutely usually what I do. But it's difficult sometimes when you're helping to run groups, or you're running groups, or you have a group of people and then a friend of a friend of a friend enters into the fray and then starts making it about them and their ideology. And I don't like booting people. I know how much that sucks to be booted. I try to get around that as much as I can out of respect. I have respect for people, even if they disagree with me. And I don't like to have to resort to those sorts of measures, but when it has come to that, I've had to. And I don't like having to do that. When you talk about you can't fathom how a grown adult can have spiritual beliefs, I can't fathom how a grown adult is so invested in the idea of convincing people that there's nothing, that materialism, naturalistic materialism, is the absolute truth, that they have to go into discussions, oftentimes casual ones, that are mentioning spiritual beliefs or philosophy in some way, and they take it upon themselves to create a debate out of thin air based on their own biases and their own ego. I can't fathom how people think that that is a good time.
See, the part that I can't fathom is the part where it's imperative that each side has to prove that they're right. That's the part I can't fathom. I don't think that that's ever been my objective. When I was younger, perhaps, I would have said something dumb like that you're either dumb or whatever. I don't believe that. I think everyone has certain aspects in how they try to grasp reality. And when I say I can't fathom it, because it's beyond me, I can't possibly imagine in my head an anthropocentric being of any kind that would favor human beings over other species in the universe. And this is what the Abrahamic religions have shown me. I'm not speaking for the Eastern religions. I'm basically, if I were to call myself anything on the planet, it'd be a Taoist. And if you ever look up Taoism, you understand that there's no discussion of Taoism. We don't waste our time trying to explain it, because we can't explain it. We wouldn't try to. And if you try to explain it, it's not the Tao. And that's it. So what I don't understand is when people start arguing over facts. People start arguing stuff. It's like, once you make a point, if that point isn't a general consensus, and it's still a matter of not contempt is the word, contention, then I back away from it. It's that simple. I'm not going to add to the cauldron that is the craziness that is all this debate about whether God exists or God doesn't. My concern is how we live together and work together as human beings as a species. That's it, plain and simple. Nothing else. Nothing else matters to me. So anything beyond that is what I can't understand and can't fathom. The argument.
Agreed. Welcome, Pat.
What's the topic?
David and I were kind of just discussing the interrelationships between religious debate and groups like this, and particularly I was sort of airing my grievances about atheists to somebody who's receptive to hearing the idea that there are atheists out there who are just complete assholes. It's not all of them, but there are some very vocal people and a vocal minority who make it about debate. And we were sort of discussing why that is, what the motivation is behind that, and kind of looking at human nature as a whole, and being a sort of a contributor to that why people behave that way as a whole.
Yeah, that's interesting. The aspect of dialogue versus debate, maybe why some groups might be more inclined towards one than the other.
Yeah, it is important. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, which is why, again, agnostics generally come up on the winning end. For those who don't know, I'm not an agnostic, but I generally tend to agree that they are maybe statistically the most sane people on Earth. So.
Well, that's because we have two extremes. If you have, the hardcore fundamentalist that's going to cut someone's head off because they don't believe, and you have the hardcore atheist who wants to ban all churches and all religions whatsoever and thinks that everyone who believes in such things is stupid. You have two far extremes, and I think that the teachings of most of the spiritualities that I've ever observed and had any measure of respect for, Christianity involved and all the others, it always with a sense of balance and walking that middle line and being aware that we're imperfect and flawed beings, and that and that that you will not be completely good and you cannot be completely bad, and if you try to do this you're going to be completely stupid on either end. So you have to try to find the completely, as close as you can, that middle ground, and that's what that's basically what it comes down to, I think. I often wonder that perhaps the reason why the atheists are so rambunctiously volatile is the same reason why at one point gays were so flamboyantly out there, because they could be, because they can be now, because at one point they couldn't. In every society, if you didn't either believe, you didn't take your ass to the church or the temple or wherever, the town talked about you like you were a witch or a warlock or something, and they'd be at your door with torches. You had to pick a side. There was no escape, and this was the way it was for thousands and thousands of years in human society. So, like, don't get me wrong, I am not giving atheists a pass for being, I'm not giving anyone a pass for being a rude asshole. I'm not. I'm saying, but when I look at it from a historical and a philosophical perspective, I say, okay, these assholes finally have a chance to stay what's on their mind without being burned at the stake. So they're going to just be, as crazy as they can.
Can I interject?
Please.
I really don't like that premise, because atheism is not a new phenomenon, and its emergence as a philosophy is very, very old. And I think the concept of atheists being persecuted is like
don't
very makes sense.
don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I mean, I'm not saying that it's some new movement. Secularism has been prevalent, my God, since Aristotle. I mean, and before that. So that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, but now there is this country, we have the freedom of speech to say what they want to say. At one point, a Catholic couldn't be president of this country. So it was, religion is a very strong cultural impetus to society. It cannot be undermined, and the groupthink cannot be undermined. And this is what I'm saying. That now atheists have the chance to actually say what's on their minds, and of course there are going to be some crazy, some strong polarities to either end. So please don't misunderstand. And I'm thinking atheism is some kind of new movement. It is not. It's been around for quite some time.
I think what Damon is speaking to is more from a microcultural perspective as opposed to a macrocultural one, or more from the perspective of very narrow definitions of generations and narrow definitions of modern culture of the West. I mean, at most, you're looking at a culture that kind of began in the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, leading into the 20th and the 21st centuries. And within that sort of that viewpoint, within there's things that like the young people now would see as their culture as being relevant. For them, atheism is new. In the grand scheme of things, in the macrocultural perspective, really taking a look at longer periods of history and longer generational gaps, and the whole span of culture going way back to much earlier cultures in Europe, in the Mediterranean, in the Far East and Southeast Asia. These ideas are very old, and that's why I mentioned in the side chat that at least in the West, the idea of atheism as a concept has been around at least since the pre-Socratics. In Hinduism, it's been around quite some time within the religion, and in Chinese philosophy, since they tend to have a more non-theistic or trans-theistic bent to a lot of their beliefs, it's most especially a part of those belief systems. But there are cultural biases and there are cultural tendencies that make atheism as a modern movement in the West such a departure from a much more stringently and staunchly monotheistic and very rigidly defined theistic viewpoint. It's a part of the reason why so many of my conversations with atheists are within the bent of religion kind of conforming to Christianity, because most people don't research. Most people don't look into history. They don't look into other belief systems. Their perception is very narrow. They're very nearsighted. They only see what is immediately relevant to their lives and to the culture that surrounds them.
Could I interject with a just an observation?
Sure.
I notice, and I don't want to generalize, but oftentimes when people from the U.S. refer to atheism, it gets conflated with secularism, not as as mutual philosophies, but as far as the goals of atheism seem to be secularist by nature, obviously. And it's difficult oftentimes for me to perceive, because the country that I'm from, a lot of things that might be called secular or liberal policies in the U.S. are normative. Like, I grew up with them, like the things that you've seen in the past year in the U.S. relating to gays wasn't something that I grew up with as being something out of the norm. Like, we were past that already, kind of idea. So I'm just using the gays as an example because that's the biggest thing I've noticed as far as a religious stance in the U.S. as far as that being in relation to the state. So that was never a big religious issue that I'm aware of in my country, and I think that relates also to maybe the projection of what atheism is, because if the U.S. is really prides itself, maybe obviously not the entire country, but at least historically and maybe at its heart as being a very predominantly independent Christian state and holding to very basic, unchanging, universal moral standards, whereas maybe a lot of countries don't have that aspect of kind of almost dynastic history. Um, it then reflects on what atheists they produce. And so that's why you have some of the most strongest intellectual thinkers and debaters of atheism coming out of England, but you might have the most strongest outspoken populists of atheism coming out of the States, because it might be more reflective of the heritage of the States and of England in comparison to, say, my country that doesn't have necessarily a religious backing to its foundation. So in England, you have its core is the monarchy, and thus extension the Church of England, because they're correlated. In the States, you might have a rejection of that, but you have a core of Protestant fundamentalist individualistic Christianity that was like the founding of your nation. Whereas where I'm from, it's a lot more complicated and has nothing to do with religion as a focal point in our nationhood, and in so much that a nation that's trying to separate from my nation purposely identifies with a religious tradition to separate themselves from me. And I think that's also reflective, thus, of our atheists. Because when I hear you guys talking about atheists, it's very different than how I interact with atheists at, say, school or on the street. They seem to have a different mindset. It has less to do about secularization of society, it has more to do with like moving away from God. Not because religion's bringing down society, but society can advance if we're believing in God. Does that make sense? Or am I just rambling?
No, I actually agree with what you're saying. Yeah, it makes total sense to me what you're saying. And I've, at the risk of even, I don't want to offend anyone, but I've often said that for mankind to live, God has to die. And I think that it's the same way like not believing in dualism of your body, like your brain. Like most people tend to believe that they have two functions, their brain and their mind. And to me, I believe that they're just one thing, and one's a byproduct of the other. So I definitely have always believed that for mankind to survive, at least either hold God to high standards than what we've been allowing the doctrines to say that this believes in, or to completely kill him or her altogether with and just face the universe on our own.
Right, exactly. That's kind of my thought pattern. The philosophy is definitely reflective of the culture, obviously, but it seems to be disingenuous when it seems to present itself as secularist in nature when it's uh, in fact reactionary. But that's maybe my bias of how I view modern atheism. I don't really view it as a true philosophy, but just reactionary philosophy in the West, at least.
Well, it certainly seems like it's reacting to, you know, what I perceive as being, you know, literalistic, dogmatic forms of organized religion. That seems to be the most common uh, debating, members of, the debate squads out there are, atheists responding to what they perceive as being dogmatic literalism or creationism, um, and they don't really engage in sort of this non-orthodox spirituality, which a number of people, at least in my view, typically hold. Um, but that's just how I see it.
I just I never understood how they seem the at least the Christians and the Muslims. I can't speak for the Jewish. I don't know enough about their religion to say, but they seem to make God this very small, petty individual that is schizophrenic enough to forget what it's created and blame that which it has, and it doesn't make sense to me. And to even worship that kind of a being, even if it was um, um, truly a God, and I wouldn't follow it because it's not the belief that I have within me. So I guess I'd be one of those guys putting a wreath around the temple of the God of love or something. I don't know, but to me they've made this being so small and so petty and such a evil and vengeful thing that I couldn't imagine following anything like that, and that's what really surprises me. Like when they write down and tell me what this thing is supposed to want of them and what it may ask them to do for it. I'm like, really? This is the type of being that you would devote your very essence to? So that's what surprises me about the hardcore fundamentalists. It's like, I don't know, man. You're gonna cut someone's throat because God told you to do it. Let God come do His own work. When I see Him come down here and start trashing off heads and things, not that I'm gonna follow Him. Like I said, I'm not. But then I would say at least He's doing His own work. He's not manipulating poor souls to do it for Him, to blow themselves up. That doesn't make sense. Why would the creator of an entire universe, the entire universe, be petty to such things? So, and people don't get that. And that's what surprises me. It's like, no. And this is what I'm saying. This is when I look at them and go, not that you're stupid, just that you're following something that is obviously detrimental, that is obvious. I mean, and if you look at it, how could you compare? I mean, if you look at the modus operandi from quote unquote what Satan does, right? Vengeful, hateful, God of evil, blah blah blah. If you look at the modus operandi, who they say God is, you don't see much difference, and they don't get that, and that's what surprises me. And that's when I go, oh my God, you're stupid, and that's when I say that. I don't just come out and say, oh, all who believe it is stupid. It's when I hear this stuff. That's when I have to say, dude, no. This is bad behavior. Roll up the newspaper, and I bat him on the nose. Bad behavior, bad. I'm just saying that. And that's my anger that I have towards religion. It's like, no, man. Any God that's supposed to be worth his salt or her salt in godhood, she better come here and teach human beings how to live, how to love. How many wars and killing do we have to do to prove that we need help? What stage of development would coming down here somehow affect that development? Would it be like giving too much information on the SAT for them to pass it? Would it be rigging it? Mankind needs help. If we can't do it ourselves, then we're screwed. And if there's going to be a deity that's going to do it, well, my goodness, they're kind of over schedule. It's crazy. It's crazy, and that's why I sometimes have this patronizing aura about me when I speak to someone who is religious. But I don't get that way until they start going into that little routine of theirs. And then I'll say something that's, pretty relevant and pretty, as binary as possible. Okay? And if that falls short, I realize that, hey, man, this culture, I look at myself as a spaceship, and I'm traveling through space, and I'm observing cultures. If I come across a warp-capable culture, I will communicate with them. But if I determine they're not warp-factor capable, I move on. I don't get involved in those kind of debates and arguments anymore. I just don't. There are other, much more interesting planets out there to explore.
Kevin,
Yeah, what's up?
you wrote something. I posted a video on the Facebook group but Ruben reposted it about the Norse mythologies, and you said one wasn't correct, but I didn't really understand your response. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know what you're talking
I
about.
could bring up the thing if you want, but
No, I know which one you're talking about.
yeah, I just
Okay.
didn't really understand since I'm not versed in the mythology.
Well, my path is Greek, obviously.
Yeah.
Hellenic polytheism, but I know a lot about other polytheisms, and particularly Norse, because many of my close friends practice Asatru or something similar. Um, the thing that Ruben posted was 25 facts about Norse gods Hollywood won't teach you, and it actually goes into description about Norse mythology. But there was one, number 20 on the list, was wrong. It was just completely wrong. Um, it said that Norse mythology was modeled after Greek mythology, which isn't accurate. What I said was that Norse mythology, along with a lot of other Indo-European mythologies, likely share a common root in Proto-Indo-European. It's an ethno-linguistic origin, which means that we can trace back all of the various European cultures to a theoretical origin culture. There's a lot of theories as to where they might be, but we're talking anywhere from about 6,000 BC to about 7,000 BC, maybe a little bit earlier than that. I also mentioned that, however, there were interactions later on. So the Norse tradition was influenced by the Romans. Same with the Celts, and there were actually syncretic relationships between Gaulish, continental Celtic, and the Romans, which I didn't mention, but it kind of correlates to that. But the point that I'm making with that is if you look at Indo-European cultures and the mythologies and the words and the concepts that they developed, these cultures were separated by thousands of miles, centuries, if not millennia, of developments. It's a part of the reason why they look so different. A lot of our studies of genetics have suggested that for a person's color to radically change, the color of their skin to change from very dark to very light would take 10,000 years. And that's just a theoretical estimate. And how it would work, that's another scenario entirely. But these European cultures went off in completely different directions, and they intermingled with cultures in the area, many of which were non-European, and that helped to influence the formation of their mythologies, the things that they were surrounded by, the plants and animals that they were surrounded by, the things that were important to those cultures, the things that developed their society. For instance, Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures didn't have as much metallurgy as a lot of the northern cultures, as the quote-unquote barbarian cultures that the Greeks and the later Romans would have interacted with. And hence why a lot of their ideas of warfare, their armor, and their weapons came from other cultures. The Gallic helm was used by the Romans. They got that from the Gauls. There's a bunch of other examples like that, like the falcata, which was a Celto-Iberian weapon that the Romans used. You get the idea. So culture was very similar. It goes off in different directions and develops differently. Divergent evolutions of cultures and mythologies are the same way. But the reasons why Norse mythology and Greek mythology, as well as ancient Vedic culture and Slavic culture, are similar is because they all root back to very earlier ideas of mythology. For instance, the idea of a sky father, Deus Pater, the sky father, comes from a much earlier tradition. Zeus comes eventually from Deus. You get the idea. So that's what I was trying to make, is that, yeah, there's some similarities topically, but one didn't create the other. They influence each other later, perhaps, but the similarities come from a much earlier root in their evolutionary process. That's what I was trying to make in that post.
Thanks.
You're welcome. getting a bit warm in here, so I turned on the air. So Damon, you still there?
Yes, I am still here and listening.
Okay. Well, you're saying in the side chat you might need to go out and pick up some things. Is that now or later? Or?
Well, I'm going to leave it to my stomach and see how much longer I can pull it out. I meant to pick up some on my way coming back from the library, and I didn't. So I'm just like, but I'm enjoying the conversation. I'm also enjoying your historical information regarding the evolution of the religions and how they diverge. I love history, so we actually hear an educated, learn explanation as to why there are similarities in the universe and Greek culture, et cetera, et cetera. It's pretty cool.
If you're at all interested in the sort of European history, look into PIE, Proto-Indo-European. It's a whole class of study that goes into theoretical relationships, tracing different European cultures through language itself. And there are iterations of these cultural concepts that are embedded in mythology that can be traced through linguistics. And what's interesting is when you see the correlations being as strong as they are, like Indra and Zeus being very similar, and Thor and Zeus being similar, just on the sheer fact of being lightning gods, but the variances and how they're different. So in Greek mythology, the sort of ubiquitous god of magic tends to be Hermes, and that's why a lot of later traditions in the Hellenistic period, like that of Hermeticism, are actually clustered around Hermes himself. There's variances there and exceptions to the rule, and trust me, there are many different deities I could go into, but Hermes is one of the sons of Zeus, as a lesser deity by description if you think of Zeus as a sort of king of the gods. But the correlation between Norse mythology, this is the most similar deity in Norse mythology to Hermes, is Odin. In Norse tradition, Odin is actually associated with magic. He took out one of his eyes and put it into the well of Mimir to gain wisdom. And a lot of traditions, and particularly folk traditions in Norse culture surrounding magical practice, surrounding seership and divination and things like that, were actually associated with Odin. This older, bearded, god of magic. What's really interesting, kind of funny about that, though, is that a lot of magical and mystical practices in Norse culture were typically associated with women. There's also things to suggest that many of the men who practiced it may have been oriented differently. They may have been some of the queer people in their society, gay men, things of this nature. So it was often relegated to this feminine practice, even though that so much of it lent to Odin. So you see the sort of differences in religion on a cultural level and how they define gender. That's just one element you could define. You could look at Thor is a lesser deity in Norse mythology, but yet is the strongest god in Norse mythology. He's the chosen son. Apollo sort of fits that bill in Greek mythology, but his domains are entirely different. In ancient Greece, he was associated with both healing and death. He could hold the lyre, the hand harp, but also could string a bow. His sister, in many mythologies, though sometimes she is the wife of Apollo, very rarely, she was actually more associated with the bow. She was a huntress. So one could easily come to this sort of conclusion that Norse had a much more fluid view of gender, but then you look at things like Apollo and Artemis. Apollo seeming to be more feminine, attached more to creativity and to healing, and Artemis being a female, but she's a virgin goddess who's associated with something that is understood to be classically male. And I use this as an example to sort of demonstrate the fact that in many cultures, the relationships between different things in society and how they are symbolized in mythology is ultimately very nuanced. The way they saw different things is very different. If you're comparing different cultures together, even other European cultures, you're going to see very minute differences that actually echo much more deep understandings that these cultures had, many of which we don't necessarily fully understand. But the linkage to these understandings, by and large, comes from language. If you understand the language of these cultures, you understand the cultures much better than you did before. And unfortunately, a lot of the studies of these ancient cultures in the West have been through the lens of a very Victorian and very Christian sort of upbringing. They make a lot of assumptions. I've mentioned this before. Stoics are not robots. Hedonists are not libertines. Hedonismos was entirely different than how we see it in the modern day. Same with Stoicismos. So our concepts of a lot of these terms, we need to sort of throw in the trash bin and take a look at them with clearer eyes and more objective eyes to get a much better understanding. And if there's any one thing I could tell you about polytheistic traditions in general, they are much more symbolic. They are non-dogmatic. They are orthopraxic, focusing on rituals and correct behaviors, but not absolute beliefs and absolute doctrines. And the mythologies were varied. There are multiple different mythologies in any given culture and multiple variations and multiple philosophies attached to different mythologies, not to mention the cults of various different deities. They were much more complicated, much more nuanced, and there was a lot more freedom to do what you wanted and to worship the deities that you were close to, though you were always encouraged to worship as many gods as you could, to respect all the gods that may be there and influencing your life and influencing creation. So a lot of the things you may be familiar with Christianity don't even vaguely apply to these earlier religions.
Well, it's always been the stories that I've enjoyed when I've listened to mythology of all the different pantheons. And to me, they were more important than the actual figures themselves. It was what they were doing. And this is why I said earlier how when I was observing the fundamentalist Christians, and I was like, well, having read so many other different stories as well, I'm like, why would you follow such barbarity? I don't understand that. But I understand if you were to follow this and then have one of love and a god of sex and a god of wine, and I get that. You know, I totally do. But it's a story. And the thing that I took from the Christian story that I always tell, because it's the one thing I took from it, was when he was being quote unquote crucified on. And he was being killed. Basically, he all he could look upon everyone was with compassion, and he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And this was a man in his very last moments of his life, and this is all he could think of was compassion. And to me, that was the story I took from the entirety of the story, completely. So anything from that point on, to me, it was crazy. I mean, not crazy in the sense that crazy, but I mean, when people started saying kill, rape, whatever, I thought it was a crazy outcome given how the man felt and what he said, or was written to have said at the last moments of his life. But yeah, so it's the archetype of the stories that I like to read and understand. And Thor wasn't actually, he didn't seem like he was really one of the better people in mythology. He seemed a bit arrogant, but I guess they tap on that a lot. One thing I want to ask you though, because I want to ask about the god Ares. I read somewhere where Ares wasn't originally the god of war. He was at one point the god of agriculture, and that he was just protecting the crops, and that was his predominant function with the early. And I will look up Proto-Indo-European. That looks very interesting stuff. But I think around that time was when Ares was actually more geared towards protecting the crops. And I was wondering if you knew anything about that, about his transformation as king on.
People got it backwards. Ares was a god of war, and a bunch of other things, by the way, specific to Greek. Mars, however, the Roman deity who sort of absorbed Ares. The Romans were originally very nuministic, and their gods were much more abstract in orientation. So they took a lot of the Greek concepts to help to flesh out and solidify their culture and their culture's sort of power and all that sort of. But the original Mars, before he took upon the sort of features of Ares, he was an earlier Etruscan deity associated with agriculture, which is why the Roman Mars is much more associated with fertility. And this sort of thing happened all the time. Apollo became much more solar than Apollon, the original Greek, and they actually correlated him a lot more with Helios, the actual god of the sun. So the Roman conception of a lot of their deities were different. The things they associated with Jupiter was much more stoic than the original Greek Zeus, who could in many ways be fearful and powerful in a different sort of sense. Some of those differences are very nuanced and they're very subtle, but quite a few of them go to much earlier beliefs. And it's important to realize that the Romans also had deities that were part of their pantheon, different classes of deities that didn't exist in Greek mythology. Janus, or Janus, did not exist in Greek mythology. He's the god of the crossroads, a male god of the crossroads who had two sides to his head, one old, one young. And that's actually where we get January from, what is from Janus, god of the crossroads. He sort of brought in the new Roman year. He was associated with a lot of other things, and his domains are very similar to Hecate, which is the goddess of the crossroads in Greek mythology. The Romans also adopted him. Just so you know, Hecate with a K is Greek. Hecate with a C is Roman. So, and there are slight variances as things progress, but that's why you have history. Hecate is she's female. She's a goddess. Janus is male. Similar in their meanings. They're gods of the crossroads. They exist in many different cultures, and the way the crossroads are symbolized can mean a variety of different things. Hecate, she's the goddess of the crossroads and is sacred in the dark moon, when the moon is no longer visible in the sky. And to the Greeks, she took out the old so that the new could come in, so that the new month, the new lunar month, could come in. That was one of her most important things. She had Ekakanea, Hecate's Debnon. Her feast was on that day before the Numenia, which is the most sacred day of the Greek month. So she definitely was very, very important, and she was also considered one of the household deities. She was associated with the dead in the underworld, and she was also associated in some forms with the Eleusinian mysteries of Demeter and Persephone in some forms. So that's the thing, is that the gods of Greek mythology are varied. Many of the gods had various different epithets. They did have different forms and different connotations depending on why they were being invoked, what festival you're talking about, what domain you're talking about, and what mythology you're referring to. Hesiod versus Orphic, I mean, that's a huge difference. Hesiodic versus Homeric is also very different. And Homeric we don't know quite as much about, same with Orphic. But Hesiod's theogony is the main myth that most people refer to when they look to Greek mythology. Homer, if he existed in the way we think he did, was a poet, and he wrote a lot of different things. Obviously, you have the Iliad and the Odyssey, but there are also mythologies and concepts that of the gods and their relationships with each other that were different than what Hesiod configured. And in Hesiod's lifetime, when he wrote some of the myths, he was very inspired by other cultures. So some of those elements that he got from Near Eastern cultures, from the Egyptians, from various other cultures in the area, in fact, helped to sort of color the mythology he created. And it is very likely that at the time, throughout the span of the classical period, and before that as well, and after that, that there are various different mythologies, many of which are completely lost to time. It would not have been unusual for there to be variations on a theme that were spread out through different city-states in ancient Greece, because The role of mythos is story. Mythology, mythologia, is the study of stories. That's what that means. And people would study their stories. If you were a young man you were a teenager entering into adulthood, you were expected to learn these mythologies because there were lessons to be learned. There were ethics in these understandings. They were understood symbolically. They were supposed to represent the domains and aspects of which the gods were in charge of, but there were so many different meanings to them. It's like if I read to you a children's book when you're a child, and you get a little older and you read it again. You get a little older and you read it again. Your understanding of that myth changes over time because you're able to understand more diverse and more complex meanings. And that's why the myths were written with such broad symbolisms, because they were meant to be layered. They were meant to be complicated. They were meant to be things that you would understand on different levels for different times, depending on your station in life. That's what myth is for. It's for instruction of cultural teachings.
Kevin, if you had the chance to talk to a god of your choice, and I don't know how deep that would go, but to a god of your choice, who would it be?
I don't mean to be crass, but that assumption of gods being that extremely literal in that sense is very offensive. And it's kind of pathetic. I hear that a lot among atheists. They symbolize things in that sort of way, and that's not how the gods
You
work.
gave me the finger.
What's up?
Is that why you subconsciously gave me the finger?
Yeah, that's exactly why I did what I did.
I see. Well, I didn't mean to insult you.
Well,
And that's not how I meant it.
can I interject?
I totally apologize. I'm not gonna argue this. That's not how I meant it, and I'm not gonna do it.
Wait, can I just spin this on the head? So, if we're not talking about obviously literal the Western concepts of gods, and
It was more of a
wait. If we were not talking about the Western concepts of gods, more so the caricatures, maybe the cartoonish archetypes of polytheism, and then we refer to them maybe in their natural habitat as being reflections of the natural world, or of different concepts of I don't know, the psyche or whatever you have you. It would be the same question, like what aspect of the polytheistic tradition, in what we would then say manifestations of gods, would you then most, I guess, want to interact with in intellectual conversation with, even if it's an archetype and not just a caricature.
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you very much for that. Because
The question is broken. It assumes that I just sit with my eyes closed and imagine shit, and I don't have experiences.
No, you took
No, not at all.
For you needed to come down literally and pink unicorns shooting rainbows at their ass for you to believe that there's some.
This is exactly this is probably why you get in arguments. This is exactly why, and thank you for pointing that out. Okay, because that's not exactly what I meant, and you're right. The argument was broken in the way that I delivered it. But your response to it was completely hostile. And that's exactly why you're finding yourself, not exactly, but it's certainly a contributing factor as to why you're finding yourself in heated arguments and debates with people. You are not innocent in this, my friend. Because I apologize if I offended you. That was not my intent. It was so far from my intent. But you immediately just broke it down into like a war zone. And I apologize. I don't know what to say. But I'll go on because it's not about you and it's not about me. It's about all of us. The fact that in Path of Abraham, I like what you're saying. It's like it's more so the representation. You know how, I don't know if you've ever gotten high or done psychedelics before or whatever. You feel, those of us who have, there's a point where you feel a kind of a level and a transcendence beyond your normal thinking frequency. And you feel like there may be something else there. Not so much as like another frequency on which to communicate. And in that my point is that if deities exist and they communicate with you, it would have to be on some frequency. And my thing is that if you were to ever find yourself in a situation where you, whatever it could be, the way your mind formed it, the way it was communicated, who knows what your archetype is, what you would imagine, not even say imagine, but to formulate in speaking with. Because we even speak to ourselves, okay? We try to simulate data, and we speak to ourselves. So if you had that experience that some of the religious people said they had in the past, where they actually met or spoke, like, what would you say? One of my favorite moments in media, and maybe a name to bring it up, it was actually the Star Trek movie where Spock's brother captures the ship, takes him to some planet where he thinks is Eden, where he's going to meet God. And he and Spock and Kirk and McCoy are there in front of this being who showed up with his big head and changing different faces and to indicate that he's a multiple personality or whatever. So God first thing says to him, how did you get here? And Kirk and Spock look at each other. Because first off, that wouldn't be a question that God would have to ask. And so then God goes on again, and he's talking about, Spock's brother, was talking about the starship that he brought and how he came there. And God asked him, well, can the starship take my greatness to this and there? And Captain Kirk goes, excuse me, why would God need a starship? And the entity says, who are you? And then Kirk goes, because he's a megalomaniac, he goes, you don't know who I am? And so my question is, when you are faced with a situation like that, what would you say? I'm not saying some Vulcan's going to take you, blah, blah, blah. I'm saying in a situation where you have reached a state of consciousness and you believe with everything that you've come to fathom, your brain, everything, that you are speaking with a deity. What would you say? And if you had the choice, if you had to formulate anyone, which one would it be? And that's a dumb question. It's a dumb question. And
Kevin, take everything he says, but take out the absolutes about truths. don't mind that stuff.
You didn't ask me if I've had experiences and what are they like for you. You asked me if I did, which assumes that I've never.
No, not
which assumes your truth. It assumes your truth that they don't exist. So the question itself is broken.
I don't think so. I think this is okay. I'm not going to speak for him.
I've been asked this question before. I've been asked this question a dozen times.
Okay,
that's where it always goes.
So Kevin, from I think we have a very good mutual relationship with each other. If I would ask that question the exact same way, but I would use the exact same words, but my mentality behind that question wouldn't be assuming you had a personal relationship with God or a divinity, a multiplicity, but I would use the exact same terminology and be asking for a specific response based off of your interpretation, not asking based off of your experience, but it's more reflective of you as a person. not reflected of your relationship with the deity, but what you're expecting out of it. Because you'd be projecting. And it is an assumption. That's the whole point of that's the whole point of the question. It is an assumption, and we're assuming what you would assume, and what would you assume that experience would be like outside the fact that you've experienced it before. It's your projection on the question. It's not based on reality at all. It's not the point.
I didn't hear. I guess it would seem that I did assume that you hadn't. I tried to stress the point that I have had hallucinogens when I've sensed and felt something else there. I didn't assume. I guess I was going on an assumption that you hadn't, and I apologize for that. But I did also stress the fact that I have had sensations and feelings where I felt that I wasn't alone, and I was totally in cognitive
after the fact.
thought, you know.
After the fact.
Well, okay. Hey, look. Okay, here's the deal. I'm going to go because I'm not going to argue with you. I don't want to fight. You do. I'm not looking for a fight. Okay? Take care, all right? Bye.
I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to answer a stupid question that was presumptive, that had baggage and weight to it.
What was the question?
He asked me if I had direct communication with a deity, who would I want? Like, he was phrasing the question in a sort of sense of like, if literally God came down, or God came down in physical form and had we had drinks together. And he was phrasing it as such a literalist, a viewpoint of deity that so many atheists I've interacted with have. I've made the joke that atheists wouldn't believe that they're supernatural unless a unicorn flied in the sky and shot out rainbows at its ass. It's on that same line of thinking. He not only assumed that it would be a literal, like, visitation, like a corporeal type visitation in the question itself. He assumed that I never had them, which is offensive. It assumes that I just sit here, and close my eyes and imagine shit. He didn't ask me, have you had any experiences? And if you haven't, what would you like to have? Or who would you talk to, or whatever? He asked the question just flat out, who would you want to talk to? And he doesn't understand that a question itself like that is presumptive. It's presumptive and offensive.
Right, because if it's what you want, then you're creating it, not receiving it. And yeah, I didn't hear it, so I don't really know what his intent was. Maybe he just had a slip of the tongue, but it does seem that a lot of people will, operate snarkily based off of their own experience, not taking into consideration that their experience is not all there is. Other people have different experience.
It's funny. Go ahead.
I'm just trying to explain why I'm lost on the situation, because I'm a monotheist, but I personally have had experiences with my deity, but I could also tell you experiences that I would want to have with my deity that I haven't had yet. And that's just as real for me, even though it's hypothetical. Even though I haven't experienced it, I can tell you and explain to you the relationship I want to have with my deity, and I strive to have with my deity that I haven't experienced yet, even though I have experienced real, tangible, one-on-one experiences with it. Doesn't mean I don't long for something else, and doesn't mean I don't long for an experience that I haven't had before. It's I don't see why they're mutually exclusive.
But he didn't ask were there any experiences you've not had that you would like to have, or are there experiences like something this or that. Here's a premise: if you had an experience like this, how would you like it to go down? He didn't phrase it that way. He phrased it in a very oppositional, very presumptive, very narrow. And for me to even answer that question would justify his own viewpoint. I know where that line of conversation has gone. I've done that over the years. I've had that same question asked to me a dozen or so times, and it always goes to the same space. So I refuse to answer a question that I consider to be offensive. That is why I generally don't talk to atheists, for that reason right there. And fundamentalists, who would probably ask the same kind of question. In fact, I have been asked that question by fundamentalists.
Yeah, and then there is the thing about psychedelics. I mean, that opens up the conversation of what they're there for, and is it possible that God gives it as a tool to make us more sensitive to certain other aspects of reality, including Himself, or just clears away our normal headspace to allow us access to the subconscious mind? I don't know.
I would say neither.
Here's the thing. He thinks that him including that after the fact sort of smooths over the rough edges and he could still ask the question. But him conflating religious experience with hallucination actually just confers his own bias. It's actually more offensive that he brought that up. Because then it's suggesting that it's a hallucination. If you'd like to have a hallucination of your choice, which one would you want to have? Which drug would you like to take?
In the relation to hallucinogenics, my response was neither, because you have to take account of all of the humans that are physically and psychologically enabled to take hallucinogenic. Sorry, I'm slurring my words. I lost my train of thought. But the question was whether such drugs were put in place in order to interact with, like, on purpose. And then you'd have to take into account all the people on Earth who would not be able to take those drugs based off of psychological or other physiological reasons. And then they would be purposely cut off from that interaction with the divine simply because they were created in a state that they weren't susceptible to those pathways. And that, I think, to me, that's illogical. But might have a different understanding.
Maybe some people need the tools, some people don't. So I don't know. I just think that that argument, like, given from an atheist, like, oh well, here I've had that too, so I'm on the same playing field. Like, it's a hallucination, so therefore you're having hallucinations about God. It doesn't necessarily need to be taken that way, because as I see it, hallucination could possibly be real. It's just not corporeal. It's not something that's physically there. So I don't think it has to be taken in a derogatory sense.
But that's how he was presenting the argument, and that's how he was presenting his experience of hallucinations. He was describing things in abstracts and archetypes in the ways in which your mind see it. He was saying things to that effect. So he was not only presenting an argument that was broken to begin with, that already was relegating to a very specific bias. He brought up another bias, thinking that I would see it in a favorable way, but it was just presenting another bias that confirms his atheism.
Well,
so either he's unaware of it or he's being disingenuous, which I'm leaning to the latter.
Well, another thing too is this fallacious idea of finding similarities and then saying it's exactly the same. Like a Venn diagram intersects. There's those points where the circles are, in the same area and have similarities, but doesn't mean, I'm repeating myself. It just, like, okay, if you're praying and you're feeling some sensation that this other person can take a bunch of mushrooms and get something similar, it doesn't mean it's the same thing. It just means there's similar results. You know what I'm saying? If that's his argument. I didn't hear the full thing. Because people are, out to explain things away. And if they can have some phenomenon that, looks somewhat like it, then they can write it off according to their ultimate presuppositions, their worldview. But alternate explanations are not verifications of one's view or refutations of someone else's view. It's just an alternate explanation is all.
Sure.
I'm sure you probably get the question a lot because you have the labeling, and probably most people don't understand it and know what polytheism is. I've heard the term reconstruction used in different ways, and I don't know if I know much about the Hellenistic whatevers.
Well, that doesn't bother me. I love explaining it from an academic perspective. How Greek religion existed, what certain things mean. I love doing that. I have no problems with that. Even if people ask questions that seem a little ridiculous, I'm fine with that. I don't like, loaded questions like that. That's why I got upset. I probably should have went about it differently. There's a bunch of ways I probably could have went about that differently, but the way he was saying it, the tone of his voice just bothered me. It got under my skin, so I got mad. And it also has to do with the fact that a lot of my experiences being here on Google Plus over the last year have been in that line. I've been in situations where there's a lot of atheists in the room, and I usually keep quiet because they're having a very aggressive argument, basically just insulting religious belief without actually knowing anything about it. Or I'll enter into a space where it's not dominated by atheists, and then one person will come in and then just ask me a bunch of stupid questions that are loaded like that. So I've had a number of experiences that have colored my reactions to certain things. So I generally don't have a very favorable view of atheism as a result of that. I have a lot of things characterized about my beliefs that they just put there. They don't ask me questions. Even if the question was a little stupid, but it was actually for having me clarify something that they're misunderstanding, I'd be cool with it. I don't like hypotheticals. I don't like what-if questions and thought experiments. I think that's for kids. Sometimes there are official thought experiments that are conducted for scientific purposes. Yeah, absolutely, I can understand that. But a what-if is stupid to me. I don't like answering those questions because they're usually always loaded.
So help me out then with the definitions. Hellenic is different than Hellenistic. I don't know what that is, and I don't know what Reconstructionism is either.
Hellenic refers to the classical period, which was after the fall of the last Athenian tyrant. And it starts anywhere from mid 500 BC to about 600 BC. It ends at the end of Alexander's reign around 300 to about 320 or so BC. From about 300 BC to about 150 to 200 BC, some people put it a little bit further, would be considered the Hellenistic period. So in and around zero is the Hellenistic period. It's late Roman, basically, late Roman period. And the differences between Hellenic and Hellenistic, an easy way you could look at that is that Hellenistic is Greco-Roman and Hellenic is Greek. Though Hellenistic definitely leans more towards the Roman. A lot of the ideas, even the ideas that had a Greek flavor, were very much informed by what was happening in the Roman Empire, and a lot of Hellenistic ideas are syncretic. There's ideas that mix together, so you have a lot more Greco-Egyptian. You also had, obviously the birth of Christianity and a lot of other belief systems. You had the cult of Mithras. Serapis, and a bunch of other foreign deities that kind of came into the Roman cultus. So the difference is the influences are very different, very, very different. Now, as far as Reconstructionism, the sort of full term to use to describe it is polytheistic Reconstructionism. And that's a term you can look up, and it refers to a subset, for lack of a better word, a subset of the neo-pagan movement. Polytheistic Reconstructionism is a methodology from which to look at older beliefs from specific cultures and reconstructing them, putting them to a point where they can be a practice, a living practice for people to adopt. And people go to different cultures for different reasons, and that's its own conversation. But polytheistic Reconstructionism sets itself apart from a lot of the other pagan beliefs that you're probably familiar with, like perhaps Wicca, in that it's focused more on being consistent to what we know historically of different cultures, saying specific to certain cultures, though there are syncretic reconstructions, and there are people who practice multiple paths in their own lives. But there are specific Reconstructionist or recon traditions that have their own names and their own traditions, and there are differences between them. A lot of modern paganism is eclectic by orientation. It tends to take from different sources, a lot of times not really going into a lot of depth into the cultures that it takes. There's a lot of what is often called cultural appropriation going on. You probably talk to the typical pagan you probably meet on the street, and if you were to ever to talk to them, a lot of their beliefs would be very abstract. They'd be very archetypal, very fluid. There's not a lot of tradition necessarily, though there are modern traditions which could be considered eclectic by default. Even traditional Wicca is eclectic in that it takes from different sources. But Reconstructionism, polytheistic Reconstructionism, largely sets itself apart, and it's part of the reason why a lot of Reconstructionists don't really consider themselves pagans in some instances, because they feel that a lot of their needs are not met, that their voice is not necessarily heard, because so much of the pagan community, so much that's going on that revolves around paganism, doesn't really reflect any of their ideas. They assume a lot of the pagan community assumes that people are eclectic. They assume that people kind of just mix things together, and that they kind of just do their own thing. And that's not every single person who would be qualified as a pagan. To me, paganism is ultimately a community. It's a classification of different beliefs, and it's even been called such. Paganism is ultimately an umbrella term, but it's a matter of contention, and people will have different views about it, obviously. But a lot of people are moving towards Reconstructionism within paganism because they're tired of all this sort of shallowness of belief and not sticking to things, not retaining traditions, and a lot of times the rest of the world doesn't really take it very seriously. Whereas a lot of Reconstructionist traditions are making attempts to have something consistent that can be shared and something that people will take seriously. So I hope that explains it for you.
So one polytheistic Reconstructionist can look quite different or believe quite different than the next.
Oh, quite definitely. Most definitely. For instance, what I practice, its general term is Hellenismus, Hellenic polytheistic Reconstructionism. Yeah, it's a big long term. Probably why we use that term. There's actually a bunch of reasons why Hellenismus is used. It actually goes back to Julian the Apostate, so it can get very interesting. But another Reconstructionist tradition would be like a Satru, or Norse or Germanic heathenry. Heathenry is a big buzz term to use for people who practice a more Germanic influenced kind of Reconstructionist path. So those beliefs are very different. The things they value, the way they see the cosmos, the way they see virtues, all those sorts of things are different. The way rituals are conducted, the way groups are structured, things like that. So I would say there is more variance between different Reconstructionists than there are between different pagans. A lot of eclectics, they kind of agree a lot more often than not, because they don't see there to be necessarily all that much need for difference. So I hope that kind of explains it.
And that was good.
It's a really kind of complex kind of thing, and it's very specialized. I mean, paganism as a whole is a pretty small subset, and Reconstructionism is even smaller. Many of us are very small groups, usually very local and very spread out. It's difficult to find people that practice the same thing. Hence why there's quite a few difficulties faced with the reality of practicing a minority tradition, but also having something that you find is consistent, that you enjoy, that you get great fulfillment out of, and correlating it to, but without making concessions to the larger kind of pagan populace. And it's one I've discussed at length, which I won't get into too much detail about. But, it's definitely an interesting subject matter if you're interested in people trying to practice some of these older ideas and the conclusions that modern people have made with these ideas, which in many cases are hundreds, if not thousands of years old. Well, to answer your question, Colin, I'd say that probably most of the generic pagans you meet, general eclectics, they lean more towards the idea of archetypes. They tend to take to a term called soft polytheism. Many pagans sort of lean towards a sort of Wiccan cosmology, or they see that all gods are the god and all goddesses are the goddess. So a lot of times they see them as aspects of either two or even a greater whole, sort of pantheistic but also somewhat polytheistic. And they tend to view things more archetypally. A lot of modern paganism has been influenced by the works of Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, especially Carl Jung. So there is definitely a sense of them being much more symbolic and much less individual. Though I wouldn't say that even Reconstructionists would consider them literal in the sense that perhaps Damon was trying to suggest with his loaded question earlier. But there is a sense among Reconstructionists of being hard polytheists and seeing gods as distinct beings with their own domains, their own wishes and influences. How that's made sense of varies between different people within the same tradition, and that's kind of core to pretty much any religious tradition. You're going to have variances. So part of the reason why the Greeks created philosophy in the first place, to examine these cultural myths, these folklores, and make sense of them in different ways for different people. But yeah, there's definitely more of a sense of things being more abstract among the general pagan populace than perhaps Reconstructionists would say. I'll be right back. I'm going to make myself some kind of coffee. Be right back.
No problem. Anybody's got a topic of conversation?
Well, not so much a topic of conversation, but I just, in checking my YouTube page, I always feel that when I lose subscribers, I'm doing something right. So I don't know. It just seems to be the case. So.
Big loss, small loss?
There's a few people. I check it just for the heck of it, especially if because I have a feeling that there are people who subscribed to my channel back when I was doing more Muslim apologetic type stuff, and they sort of forgot about me, and then now that they're seeing the current stuff that I'm doing, they're like, oh, well, screw this guy, and they're unsubscribing. At least that's my theory. So
Yeah, you were dormant for a while.
yeah, I guess a whole year. I think I didn't produce anything. Um, yeah.
So I guess I could throw it out there. What made the switch? What was the light bulb, I guess?
This is that a question for me? The Switch.
Yeah, for you.
Uh, hmm. Well, there's a long drawn out version. There's a short version. I guess I'll I'll, I'll do the short version just for the sake of time. Um, uh, I think what basically happened a few years back. It's been like 2 years now, 2 or 3 years. Well, really, it started with taking this comparative religion class back in I think 2011. I think it was. Um, and you'll have to forgive me, Path. I don't know how long you've actually been watching my stuff because I honestly I didn't even know that when you came in here. I didn't even know that you actually did watch my stuff. So I don't know how long you've been watching my tedious videos.
Uh, I don't think I think I subscribed recently, like maybe in the past few months, but probably, oh man, 2013 probably.
Okay. Um, yeah, that answers it because yeah, I needed to just sort of know like how far back I needed to go, but yeah, I mean, I guess I took a comparative religion class back in 2011, and the professor was really good about you know I'm sorry, did you want to say something else? I see your microphone going. Oh, okay. Um, yeah, so that was about, yeah, 2012. Yeah, so about the year prior to that, I was still very fiercely defending Islam, and pretty much most of my videos would suggest that. And I was, doing polemical stuff and apologetics and all this stuff. And it was my last semester at my community college before I transferred to, the 4-year university where I finished my bachelor's in psychology. But it was the last semester, and I thought, well, all right, I've heard things about this philosophy professor, this humanities professor who teaches comparative religion. I thought, yeah, all right, and really, I can even remember how arrogant I was then. My thought was like, yeah, I've been talking about religion for how many years? This will be a cinch, easy A. And I'll just go in there and I'll just confirm my own, beliefs and argue with people. That's literally why I signed up for the class. And the first day, uh, he started way back. With regards to comparative religion, he started way back into like ancient religion. So he started with like Sumerian and Babylonian myths, and the similarities were just so striking to me. And he also, it was the first time I was exposed to looking at religion from um, a Jungian perspective and from the perspective of Joseph Campbell. So not taking things literally, but also very historically critical. I mean, the class was so great because he looked at it from three major perspectives. Basically reductionist criticism, The second would be the perspective of, essentially all these things are true, literally. The kind of, I would, for lack of a better phrase, the quote unquote typical religious perspective, for lack of a better phrase. And then the third was this more symbolic perspective, which I had never thought of religion in such a nuanced way up until this point. Um, and so it really caused me to just realize that I needed to start looking at things from a totally different perspective. Um, and and so, I started looking into different religions, even though I had already been doing that. But I started doing it not from the perspective of like, okay, I'm a Muslim and I'm going to show why Islam's the best religion, etc. Right, and why Christianity and Judaism are lacking, and why Islam is the answer. So I started looking at it from a different perspective, the perspective of looking at each tradition on its own. And I think what started unraveling for me as a Muslim at the time was, I don't want to say I was ever a conservative fundamentalist Muslim, but I certainly, and I think I was more pluralistic than some dogmatic Muslims usually are, because I didn't think that all non-believers were going to go to hell and things like that. But one thing that I realized I was doing is when I would read the Quran, I literally thought the stuff in the Quran literally happened. And so what got me starting down the path of critical thinking towards Islam itself was, uh, the fact that my professor talked about the Exodus narrative and how there really wasn't any historical basis for the Exodus narrative. And I started doing research on that subject. And in fact, my final paper, my major paper for the end of the semester, was a historical analysis of the Exodus. And I looked at it from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So I looked at the Bible and the Quran, etc., and the historical record, and concluded that, as far as I could tell, the Exodus never actually happened in the literal way that it's described in the Quran and the book of Exodus. And so that was probably the place where I just, went, well, if that's not literally true, what else that I've been believing should I be looking at from a different perspective? And so, I spent from 2011, from that point to now, basically looking at Islam in a more critical way. And ironically, I had looked at Christianity in a really critical way. I read like Bart Ehrman and criticized the Bible and said, oh, there's these contradictions, there's historical inaccuracies, there's theological issues that I have, the Trinity doesn't make any sense to me, blah, 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 blah. And, that's why I left Christianity. Well, excuse me, what I realized is that when I converted to Islam, I didn't do any of the same critical things that I had done in Christianity that I did to Islam when I first converted. Because at the time, Islam just answered it answered my hunger for a theological position that at the time made sense to me. And so what I realized is when I turned my critical faculties to Islam, the same problems that I had had with Orthodox Christianity, I started to have with Orthodox Islam, namely, historical criticism, textual criticism, and certain theological positions. The killer for me was the concept of predestination in Islam. That was sort of the killer for me. So then I didn't just walk out of Islam. Oh, go ahead. I know I've been rambling for a while. If anybody has any questions or wants to chime in about something.
You can continue, but I will interject at the end to ask you about the predestination aspect.
Sure. Yeah. So I didn't just walk out right then and there. I mean, I certainly walked out of Sunni Islam, but I started kind of. What I did is I realized I wanted to reread, the history of Islam. And this is before I read the real critical stuff, which I'll end with in a moment because it kind of brings me to where I am now, in some ways. But I started reading kind of the traditional, pretty soft historical. And soft, I mean, it wasn't very critical. It was like kind of Karen Armstrong stuff, like Islam History 101. And I started looking into the different sects. Like, I actually had never really looked into the Shia perspective very much, or the Mu'tazilite, or the different groups of Sufism. And even though I had chilled with the Mevlevi whirling dervishes when I considered myself a Sunni, and I had considered myself following the Mevlevi tariqa, or the school of thought of Sufism, I started looking at, okay, well, if I don't consider myself a Sunni anymore, what can I consider myself? And so I kind of played with the idea of calling myself a Mu'tazilite, or maybe just following a particular brand of Sufism. And the more, or even like the medieval Spanish Muslims like Ibn Arabi, Ibn Hazm, and Averroes. Uh, yeah, yes, Reuven, I know. and so and so I eventually, what happened is I realized, okay, well, I now consider myself a certain particular Muslim at that time, but I really didn't have a community because I didn't really jive with the mainline Sunni or Shia perspective. There wasn't a mosque anywhere that was a Mu'tazilite mosque, or there was a Sufi mosque, but it was like really far away from where I live, and so I started to miss community. And just the more and more I read, the more critical I became of Islam as an organized religion. I got to a point where I was sort of tired of encapsulating my spirituality in an organized religion. I found myself becoming more of a universalist. So right around, I guess you could say, like, the end of 2011, the beginning of 2012, I was starting to head towards a more Unitarian Universalist, spiritual but not religious perspective. Because I just felt, well, really what it came down to was I realized that it was stupid of me to call myself a Muslim when there was nothing that really, I thought, okay, why call myself a Muslim when I don't actually accept the following things? Listing off all the things, right? It would be like, why would you call yourself a practicing Jew if you don't accept some of these fundamental things that a quote unquote practicing Jew would be able to label oneself? And so the realization was, okay, I guess I don't consider myself a Muslim anymore, and I really, I just can't. And so I yeah, well, that's true, Ruben. I mean, I'm, I guess really I'm just saying for myself, I just found like the label just didn't really fit anymore. And I just, so, I just kind of went back to the drawing board. I just started looking at all religions and all spiritualities again, not really intending on actually joining anything, except for I did go to a Unitarian Universalist church for a while. A few, I should say a few times, and more and more, I had more and more friends that were UUs. So I was like, okay, this is pretty cool. There's community, but there's no forced dogma. There's no assumed doctrinal beliefs that the members have to hold, and that really jived with me, right? And it wasn't until I stumbled across the works of Emanuel Swedenborg, the 18th century Christian mystic, that I suddenly found myself back in a more kind of like church community that, again, is incredibly liberal and progressive and not dogmatic. So that I guess I just got burnt out with holding dogmatic doctrinal beliefs that I just started to disagree with. I think that was a huge part of it. So that is my short answer.
That actually was a really well concise summary, and I can't say I actually have any questions because that was pretty well laid out. But I'll go back to your issue with predestination in Islam.
Okay. Did you have a question about it, or do you just want me to tell you why I started to disagree with it?
Yeah, you just brought it up, but you didn't really explain what the issue was. Besides that, you had an issue with it.
Yeah, well, it's not just within Islam. I just find the concept of predestination it just doesn't make quite any sense to me on a metaphysical or theological level. The idea that, and I think mainly it's predestination as it is used in the context of salvation. I find that to be really grim. The idea that from the beginning of time, God essentially has selected a group of people to be saved, and everybody else is going to burn in everlasting torment. I found that to be rather problematic. And in the context of Sunni Islam, the way in which qadr, predestination, was, because this was actually one of the early controversies within Islam, right? So this is how you have uh, the you have the what becomes the Orthodox Sunni position, which is generally championed by the Ash'ari theological school of thought, and then why they were against the Mu'tazilites, because the Mu'tazilites pretty much rejected Salvific predestination, and they championed pretty much that God gave all humans free will explicitly, and so and there are variations between the two groups, but I tried to actually, I read some of the arguments for the Sunni perspective of predestination, which is an attempt to have a middle ground between complete free will and complete predestination. So it's sort of like it's so complicated and philosophical that I can't even really give you a good summary of it. But it's like there really
compatibilism.
is. What is it?
Compatibilism. It's called compatibilism.
Okay. Yeah, so it's like Imam Ghazali and a few other Sunni Ash'ari scholars attempted to bridge this gap between the two, and I sincerely, like, I own a few books by Imam Ghazali. I tried to read some of the, I went from basically scholarly works to Muslim apologists online in my attempt to just say, okay, can someone explain to me the Sunni Orthodox perspective of predestination, have it make sense to me, or that it would jive with me personally? And I sincerely read tons of articles and books on the subject, and I even read, hadiths that Sunnis typically point to prove the point, and I just was left with like this feeling of like, this is just, I just can't agree with this, theologically speaking. Of course, being a theist myself, the question is always posed like, well, okay, an all-knowing God and who knows everything, et cetera, et cetera. And I do say that it is pretty, it can be a metaphysical conundrum, but in terms of salvation, particularly, because, the mystery of God knowing everything, and yet, and the potential paradox that we have free will, that, to me, that's a separate issue. I think we can all have a very nerdy conversation about the implications of that particular paradox, but the real problem I have is when it comes to the context of salvation, where where people are going to say X group is going to burn in hell because God selected them from eternity, and then group Y will be saved. And while I don't think every single religion or group characterizes predestination as such in the exact same way, I certainly think that anything heading in that direction just really irks me, and that was one of the conundrums I had with that particular pillar of iman or belief in a.
So your name is Colin?
Yes.
Okay, and you said you're a Muslim?
I was.
But you're still a theist of what kind?
I'm a Swedenborgian.
Oh no, I don't know that word either. Crap, I'll Google it.
Don't feel bad. Don't feel bad. No one knows what it is.
Yeah, so I stepped out for a little bit, and then I guess we were talking a little bit in the side chat about Calvinism, and it sounds like you guys are still on the subject. So, yeah, to me, it never really made a whole lot of sense. This idea.
Wait.
Huh?
Sorry, what? I just got lost track of the conversation, sorry.
Oh, well, I was just gonna respond to why I don't think it's makes a whole lot of sense to present some sort of middle of the road compatibilist idea. Maybe someone else can explain it to me better, but it seems to be the common, or one of the common ways things are addressed, because they, on one hand, can't help but to see certain passages that state this in the Bible, and then yet their emotions don't want to accept that, because it seems like God's a big evil, whatever they want to call him, or he's not fair or something like that. But it's to me, it's like, if he values this notion of autonomy or free will for mankind, they, over and above them screwing themselves for eternity, then they haven't really left the boat of the very problem that they emotionally that they had to begin with, a psychological issue of accepting that idea. It's like, if you had one of the examples I like to use is, if I were a T-1000 Terminator, and God is way beyond that, a fleet of Terminators, all powerful, but yet I zoomed in with my zoom retina, whatever, lens in my eye, and saw some chick getting raped in the apartment across the street, and I just sat there and did nothing. I have the knowledge of it. I have the power. I don't have to worry about guns because I'm a Terminator. No threat's going to get me, and I don't do anything. Then I can't help but to conclude that the Terminator that he wanted the rape to happen, or at least he deemed something as above, intrusion in that whole scenario. And if white is the road to destruction, most people go into hell. I don't see how the Arminian or the compatibilist really escapes the blade that they say is on the neck of the Calvinist.
On that same vein, could I then posit the question to the room on people's personal beliefs about free will? Maybe help clear up any misconceptions.
Fire away.
I guess I'll go first then. Absolutely do believe in free will. I do not believe in predestination. I think the concept of free will is strictly in the realm of the choice in ethical and moral decisions. I do believe that there is a natural evolutionary course of mankind towards a certain direction, which has been prophesized, but I don't think that factors into free will whatsoever, and I think they're mutually exclusive. And when I say prophesize, I mean through the Jewish prophetic tradition.
Right, but isn't that it, though? Our very natures are determined by none other than God.
I disagree 100%.
They're not? So that's just like, chaos? Like,
I don't think it's not chaos. It's a mixture of nature and nurture. There's an aspect of you that's built in from the beginning, which we would, I guess, define as being passed on through genetically. And there's an aspect that's brought on through the environment that you're brought up in.
Right, but my nurture comes from the nature of other people.
Sometimes, not always. I don't think nurture necessarily is confined to the realm of other people. I think it's also environment and, to a degree, one's own personality and their exposure to the outer world. But I think it's a lot more complex than just saying that nature is how your parents brought you up. It's also nurture is how your parents brought you up, but it's also
society,
your culture, and yeah, exactly. It's not.
But those are all composed of people, which have natures.
Yeah, but I also think it's also. I guess this is a harder argument to make, but I also think it's your literal environment. Like, I think a person who grows up in a rural environment would have a very much different, I guess, personal outlook than somebody who grew up in an environment that was so densely urbanated, or such a dense urban population where nature was a treat in a way. I think it plays a role in the psyche. I think So I think the idea of an outside influence isn't just people, but it's also your literal environment. And to a degree, it's also the culture that's may not dictated by people, but things that are just innate in culture that people don't have any say in.
Well, but even the environment, and I know there's variations for, the people are different, right? Some people are farmers, some people work in business offices. But that's not really what I'm driving at. It's the nature and case of the fallen and how far it fell had to be a decision that God made, because it could be worse, right? It could also be better. And apparently in heaven, we're not going to be able to restart this fall all over again. So our natures will be changed.
I suppose, but I also don't agree with the fall or in heaven. So I think that's where we might not be able to exchange.
Okay. Well, yeah, I guess that might be a different argument, because I'm just basically going from like this notion, people who claim to follow the Bible. There's compatibilists in the Christian camp, and then there's the free willers in the Christian camp, and then the determinists in the Christian camp. Now, outside of that, there's a variety. I don't really know your perspective or where you're coming from exactly, but maybe you could fill in the blanks.
I follow Torah-based Judaism.
But even then, some would say Judaism being the bud of the flower of Christianity, they're connected. So we got this Elohim, who, creation account and the fall is all in first few chapters of Genesis.
Yeah, but when you say fall, you're talking about a specific doctrine that is not found in the Hebrew Bible. That's why I just say the fall, because I know what you're talking about when you fall. You're talking about a theological concept that perpetuated over generations, which Jews do not believe in. That's why I say I don't believe in that. I believe in the story in Genesis. We just interpret it in different ways because we have different understandings of the text. That's all.
So then what do most Jews, because there's probably some variance there too, believe, or I guess more specifically, what do you as a Jew believe that the fall, or like the exact parameters of the fall, how far does it go, and I guess what bit of it is under God's control and what part is not?
Could you first define the fall, and then I could better answer your question?
I guess going from a state of not having any sin, and I don't know how long it took before Adam and Eve, bit the dust or whatever. Might have been a few days only, for all we know. Maybe less, maybe more. But the fall being that the sin now entered in, therefore the creation itself groans, meaning there's like more weeds or harder to make crops grow. And now you have a much greater propensity towards wickedness. Well, and also too the curse of condemnation for those who don't have a redeemer. I know you don't, you're not going there, but the fall of men's souls into a sinfulness that needs some sort of resolution.
Sorry. Yeah. So I don't know. It's a hard conversation to have because I don't believe in any of that. So like, it's just not there for me. So like, the idea of when we relate back to the concept of Genesis and the narrative of Adam and Hawa, or Adam and Eve, is that the repercussions, I guess you'd say, of the fall or the original sin is that we are bound to a materialistic existence which would means that we have a difficulty with God because we have to strive for our livelihood. And the other repercussion is that the other reflection of divinity, which is creation, is a double-edged sword because it's met with a concept of pain, hardship, and struggle. So that, to me, is original sin, and that's what we're living with, because in Genesis it says that was a repercussion of the expulsion of the garden, was those aspects of man's relationship to God would be symbolically be hardship in the world, be it a livelihood or reproduction. So the idea of like it being like redemptive and sin and a savior for me doesn't exist, because I just kind of read the text more maybe like in a plain matter. So the idea of repercussion of the fall is maybe a little bit more literal than you would read it, I guess.
So you would just say that the death is just meaning now you're going to physically die, whereas before they wouldn't have, Adam and Eve?
Well, that's another conversation about if death existed before or not. But I would say the idea that that repercussion of death, I think, is pretty plain. It's the idea of a mortality, a limit of one's experience in this world. It's not that it's been spoiled, but it's been limited. It's more like fleshed out, I guess we could say, later in the prophets, which I guess we could argue, like, can you say the prophets have any authority on the narrative of the Garden of Eden? I guess they don't in that aspect, but you would also have that there's an idea of it returning to a state where it was supposed to be in the Garden of Eden, where there was like an endless amount of knowledge, or not knowledge, but relationship with the divine, whereas the spoil of the Garden of Eden was a halting of that, the aspect of mortality, I guess. That could be argued, but it depends who you ask. Not to ramble, sorry.
So yeah, to answer Jonathan way back, I was scrolling up. You asked my understanding of Calvinism. Well, I'm only going because I've never read anything by Calvin. I've read quotes here and there, just what in modern Christian culture, presents it as in Reformed circles, that God is the one who elects, not based off of anything in them, like we might elect presidential candidates, but he elects who are his. Those people will come. They will want to come, but he will cause them to want to come to him and exercise faith, and as a result be given the Holy Spirit and therefore produce good works and more of that. That's another thing too, like this whole idea of free will. I mean, any born-again Christian will say they don't want to sin ever, even though they have a conflicting desire where they kind of do want to do the sin in some sense, but in a more ultimate sense they don't want to do it, yet they can't, so they don't really have any sovereignty over their own will. It's not free, it's in bondage. And one of the people most known in the Reformation movement was Martin Luther, who wrote a book, The Bondage of the Will. So I guess that's pretty much it in a nutshell, that from A to Z, from beginning of salvation to the end, it's all of God. You will be, the whole tulip. You will stay and persevere till the end. And you can go further and just say God is sovereign over everything. The wind, the earthquakes, the bad events on the news, the good events on the news or not on the news, everything. It's all in orchestration by God. And once you start peeling back the layers or digging a little deeper, it can become uncomfortable to embrace certain doctrines, and I can relate to that. And that's what I was talking about. Like, how far does your average Calvinist go with their determinism? The author of evil. That phrase is thrown around out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's a pretty good summary. I don't know. I mean, I tend not to have a problem with the problem of evil and things like that because um, it's not our focus. Our focus is the grace of God in amidst the fallen world. And looking forward to the kingdom to come. And when I hear the word Calvinist, I think comfort. I think peace. I think contentment, because there is that divine assurance in God's complete and total authority over everything. And I tend not to worry too much, and I'm always like sort of brought into consternation over people who are really bent out of shape over, oh well, that makes God a tyrant, or God's, some sort of evil baby killer or something like that, and I'm like, well, human beings are evil baby killers, and actually all those evil things you just mentioned just points us more closely toward our need of Christ. So I can't even fathom the sort of arguments, but I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just the difference between being on the other side, being on the other side of effectual calling, those sorts of things. Can I explain Calvin's stance on what?
The topic of free will.
Free will. Oh, yeah. So I've read the Institutes, or an abridged version of the Institutes. I still haven't read the whole thing in full. But his view is a, I wouldn't call it compatibilistic, but he mentions both it's absolute predestination, but I guess it's free will without human autonomy, if you will. It's free will in the sense of limited free will. It's volition. I like that word. Let me give me a few minutes. I'm gonna try. There's a passage I like sort of highlighted in that Institutes where he explains it. I'm gonna try and find it. I keep it on my shelf. It's gonna take a few minutes so you guys can talk.
Yeah, I guess I can relate to what you're saying about a healthier way to look at it. Having faith, hope, and love, and focusing on that. You don't really have the anxiety or the dark, morbid thoughts about the subject. But I can see how people also, from time to time, might consider it and get to where they say, man, like, question it. This doesn't seem to make sense. Or if it does make sense, they feel like a little uneasy with it.
Kevin, free will? Yay, nay?
I think that probably the easiest way of describing my belief in modern philosophical terms would probably be compatibilism in some form. And there are concepts within classical Greek philosophy that describe three parts to the soul. It's often called Plato's tripartite soul, and there's the basis desire of humans is this sort of epithemia, which is like the root core bodily kind of desire. And there's much more complicated versions of this, but this is the simplest one. You have the epithemia, which is the core root, like primal animalistic part of the desire, and then you have the thumos, which is the heart. That's sort of like our drive, our impetus to do things, to what most people can probably consider classically desire. And then you have the logos or the logistron, which is the rational mind, the sort of the highest part of what we would consider being. And there's also much more complicated stuff about that. But the Greeks kind of saw it that the logos, that one's rationality was the charioteer, and that the other two aspects of root desire were supposed to be under the reins of your rationality of the logos. So if you weren't, if your thumos was too strong, if your epithemia was too strong, it meant that your rationality was not in check. They saw it as a sort of like a pyramid, almost like you have like a food pyramid, where the thing at the top is kind of the apex, and you have the things below that. And to the Greeks, it's important to have a sort of stasis or a stabilization of self. So, but ultimately they believe that the rationality was the thinking, active, undetermined desire of a person, that there's will, that you have that sense of free desire, and the lower you get, the less it's you, and the more it's a determined desire. So there's sort of a gradient from pure will down to purely determined animalistic kind of desire. So that, putting it to spectrum of Greek philosophy and Greek religion, is compatibilist in orientation. I hope that kind of makes sense of it.
Oh, that one guy who used to be a Muslim left. I was going to ask him a question.
Alrighty. I think, yeah, Ruben posted something that's pretty good. I'm actually looking in a section called God's Election and Man's Destiny, and all Calvin is saying in this section is more lovely words than I would use, because, I was just sort of paraphrasing what he had already said. It's meant to be a comfort. It's meant to tell us of our assurance. And Calvin uses some pretty strong language. He says, when we look for assurance about our election, we should cling to those signs which are clear evidence of it. One of Satan's deadly weapons is to attack believers with doubts about whether they are among the elect, and then incite them to look for answers in the wrong way. And the wrong way means puny man trying to infiltrate the hidden depths of divine wisdom, going back to remotest eternity to discover what God has destined for him. So he falls into a huge abyss, gets entangled in endless snares, and buries himself in thick darkness. The stupidity of the human mind has to be punished with destruction whenever it tries to aspire to divine wisdom by its own strength. It is a deadly temptation to which we are all prone. There is hardly anyone who does not think sometimes, if my salvation comes only from God's election, what proof have I of that election? Then this thought dominates an individual. He will be permanently miserable, in terrible torment or mental confusion. The fact that these thoughts deprive a man of peace and rest in God is proof of their error. We must avoid them like the plague. Many regard the discussion of predestination as dangerous sea, but we can have a safe and tranquil journey if we do not rashly court danger. It is fatal to pry into God's eternal purposes apart from His Word, but if we keep to the account of predestination in God's Word, then we shall find deep comfort. Our inquiry must begin and end with God's calling. Believers need to realize that the daily blessings from God's hand have their origin in secret adoption. Isaiah writes, "You have done marvelous things, things planned long ago," so we can be sure that God will impart as much of His wisdom as we need to know. So, and there's a summary. I mean, that's just an excerpt. You know, when you read the writings of the Puritans, I'm actually doing a project on Jonathan Edwards right now. You really get this complete and total sense that it's actually what they believe, you know, and they practice it in their day-to-day life, and you know, it is a comfort and great struggle. I'm reading Marsden's Yale University Press biography of Edwards right now, and there's an excerpt from one of Sarah Edwards' letters to, I guess it was, she was ill and she received the news of her husband's death, and she says, you know, what shall I say? A holy and good God has covered us with a dark cloud. Oh, that we may kiss the rod of reproof and lay our hands on our mouths. The Lord has done it. He has made me adore His goodness, that we had Him so long. But my God lives, and He has my heart. Oh, what a legacy my husband and your father has left us. We are all given to God, and there I am, and love to be. You know, it's resignation to the idea that, you know, we don't understand God's interests, but we believe that He's got our best interests in mind, even when that's extraordinarily hard pill to swallow. So.
But maybe not so much for the individual who's thinking about it. Like if they consider themselves in the grace of God, but yet they're thinking about other people and maybe even the majority of the world. And you know, just you look around, you see not just temporal pain and suffering. That's the tip of the iceberg. It's the eternal aspect that starts to freak you out when you contemplate that for long enough. And so I guess it's, you know, at least my conclusion is, okay, if the Scripture says God's thoughts are above ours, that has to have some application somewhere. Or if the Scripture says lean not on your own understanding, it has to have some application somewhere. That seems to be one of them, if any. I mean.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, I think that that's something that inspires action. I don't think it's something that hinders it. I mean, one of the reasons why John Wesley hated Calvinism was had to do with he didn't believe that it made people do good things. He thought that it would basically say, well, because God's in control, then why should we feed the homeless? Why should we do anything? And it's just false logic, and it's really strange considering, you know, even his contemporary George Whitefield. I mean, he was, you know, one of the big proponents, if not the main force behind the Great Awakening in America, and he was a Calvinist. You know, he was probably the most active guy out there.
Well, that seems to be a simple confusion of the all-knowing mind of God versus a finite reference point, and also conflating roles of God and man. You know what I'm saying? Like, you should, first of all, just want to do the good, but you could also simultaneously know that I have to get up off the couch and do things, but at the same time, when I do get off the couch, or if I don't, God preordained that. That doesn't take away from any role and or responsibility that I can play and should want to play.
Yeah, exactly. So why aren't you a Calvinist again?
Who, me?
Yeah.
I didn't say I'm not.
Oh, okay.
I just said that in my conversation with, and I guess it might be mostly younger Calvinists,
Mm-hmm.
when I start talking about, God ordained evil, everything, you know, like I'll take it to its fullness, and some people who call themselves Calvinists are not comfortable with that. You know, what's the term? Double predestination. I mean, that just seems to be a logical.
It's a logical extension of predestination.
Right.
Yeah. Some people have a problem with that. Again, it's just a logical it's just a logical extension of that. I mean, how are you going to profess belief in a omnipotent God who's infinite in nature, and somehow and say that he's in control of everything, and somehow expect there to be an inkling of human choice? It doesn't make any sense to me. And but I first dismissed with free choice. It was really, you know, before I even started going into Calvinism, it was, you know, really just understanding scientific theories about how our universe sort of came to be, formation, universe, or solar system construction, and just all of the different forces, and looking at, you know, just chain reactions and things like that. Every action has a consequence, if you will, and you don't have to be religious to dismiss with free will. Every decision that a person makes is shaped by outside forces. There's no way to take it outside of those outside forces. There's no such thing as a completely free choice. You're always going to have context there. You're always going to have, you know, checks and balances. I mean, we have entire philosophical theories, utilitarianism, for example, as a big one, that sort of says we're going to make choices based on all of this different data that we collect, and even that data determines the choice. So. And even those choices tend to be arbitrary based on whatever person's upbringing is, etc.
Yeah, there's so many minute details that lead up to specific routes that they would have to be under 100%, you know, bumper rails, or you know, not even guidance. Control is probably the best word. But a good book that I read by Jay Adams, it's a small and quick read, called The Grand Demonstration, I think, gives it a little more color. Have you read that one?
No, I have not.
Okay. I guess some passage in Romans. It's been a while since I read it, but basically, God, not being the nature of evil, creates it to do all this sort of thing for a demonstration. A grand demonstration, not just for human entities or angels, but other hosts and different creatures that are described in Scripture. And there's not a whole lot much more that's said about it. Now, I don't know why we would expect to understand it completely, given that we're super finite. But I don't know. And it gets to a point where you find a lot of people, even under the name of Calvinists, who get a little squeamish, and I say, no, you need to either abandon your Christianity, or I don't know, maybe that's not the best advice. Just abandon the title Calvinist, at least. Or just
what is the point again?
Huh?
I said, what is the point again? Sorry.
The point of what?
Yeah, abandoning your title of Calvinist.
Oh, because of them. It's not to say that the feeling of uncomfortableness is the problem. It's just that you'll get a lot of resistance and argumentation that this is the case, that God preordained every last bit of evil that ever happens, even the baby rapes and all this, everything that gets brought up, right? Well, we can go worse than that. Hell is something that did not exist prior to its being created or made and existing, and that's like the most concentrated, quarantined off, yes, but concentrated and eternal evil. But it's also a punishment,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, again, to me, evil in the world, I think, is the biggest evidence for a person's need of redemption. I think that it points us toward Christ. It doesn't take away from our faith, and failure. To me, I think there's just like a failure to grasp, a failure to understand what an infinite God, what that whole idea means. And people, they want something that's a little bit more congenial to their everyday lives, that doesn't disturb them, doesn't cause them to have any real change in lifestyle, attitude, behavior, whatever. And I'm okay with offending people. So what? If I exist and that offends you, I mean, that's why I have constitutional rights.
Well, when you have a challenge to your reason or your emotions, it seems to me that if you're submitting to the God of the Bible, you have to let your mysticism and your rationalism go by the wayside.
Oh, no, not at all. You.
No, I don't mean you lose your mind or you're not rational in it.
No, I understand what you're saying, but I mean, you've got to understand how we view those things. I mean, if you want to know what a Calvinist view of reason is, you gotta look up Cornelius Van Til and presuppositional thinking, presuppositional apologetics. He pretty much summarizes what the Reformed community has been talking about for many years.
Okay, maybe I'm using the term in a different way. I'm just using it in the generic sense. Like a person says, oh, this doesn't make sense to me. Well, that's not surprising. You're still in the flesh. You're not fully sanctified. You're not glorified. So are you going to submit to what Scripture says, or are you going to go with how you feel or how you think it should be?
Well, I mean, it's definitely not that, though. I mean, you certainly don't ask somebody just to submit to something because it's written down. You have to point it out to them, and that does take a long time. And I mean, I really applaud the work of like Tim Keller. Tim Keller is a Calvinist. He wrote a New York Times bestseller called The Reason for God, and he does a good job of giving a Calvinist view of the world, while at the same time trying to put it into the best modes and language for modern day folks. I mean, he pastors a church in New York, and everybody's a skeptic. So he writes that way. He writes in a way that's going to appeal to skeptics. And the reality is, we believe in something called the doctrine of concurrence, which means that whatever God has actually said in Scripture is actually true in reality, but it expresses itself in reality in myriad ways. So, when something is deemed as sinful, there are natural consequences that happen as a result, and we can sort of, explaining those things to people. We don't just say, hey, look at your Bible. No, we say, look. Well, the Bible says this, God says this, and look what society has done, and oh my goodness, this is bad. And then sort of like, oh, okay, well, maybe the Bible is true. Not because society verifies it, it's in the Scripture, but we can at least draw those parallels.
No, I understand the value in what you just said. I guess I was more or less talking about a person analyzing themselves, and or if they're talking to someone else and they've been down the road and they're kind of a few hours in, and then they're just getting to an ultimate point like, well, oh well, this is what you got to come to at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Calvinism should inspire people to want to know more about the world around them. Like I said, I'm doing this project on Jonathan Edwards right now. He's a living, well, dead now, but he was a living, breathing example of that. I mean, he was on the forefront of sort of embracing the new science. He actually died of a smallpox inoculation. He really supported vaccinations. They were in the new stages back then, and he contracted smallpox while he was the president of the College of New Jersey, which was Princeton University. So, I mean, it seems odd to me, because the argument that I get from many people is that Calvinism stumps intellectual thought. Calvinism stops people from developing and keeps them into these boxes of doctrine and dogmatism. And the most famous Calvinists that we know of in the world were the exact opposite of that in their day-to-day lives. So I don't know. I think it's just a lack of understanding.
Well, I think everybody has dogma that, when pressed, is pretty much just as narrow as they might think their counterparts are. Even though they want to, like a relativist, they like to present themselves as so open, yet they're not when they come across someone else who they deem a dogmatist. That's just one example, but.
Yeah, I get the feeling that dogmatist is a trump card. I face that a lot from liberal Christians. As soon as they hear the word Calvin, or they hear, it's actually two groups: the liberal Christians and the charismatic Pentecostal Christians. Both regard the Reform camp as sort of dogmatists, simply because our ideas disagree with theirs.
But what do they mean when they say that you're a dogmatist? Okay, so.
Well, what they mean is, we really value teaching and intellectualism, and the constant retort I get is like, you Reformed Presbyterians, you think you're so smart with all of your teaching and all of your logical arguments and everything else. What you really need to do is just embrace the Spirit. You need to embrace mysticism, basically. I get that from liberal Catholics, and I get that from Pentecostals.
Well, the Spirit is who, and on what terms can I get the Spirit, and maybe a host of other questions, and then what do you know? We have a doctrine. So,
Yeah, especially, I mean, gosh, the Religious Affections is a treatise on the Holy Spirit. I think the Reformed camp writes more works on the Holy Spirit than any other topic. But that was something I had to learn myself because I did not start out in this area of thought, and it was something I had to learn on the way in, and I had a lot of bad notions just because that's how I was socialized, I guess you would.
A lot of these misunderstandings, I think, have a lot to do with social human relations because they have had a past or history of coming across certain people in that group. They already don't like the ideas, but then they come across people who are kind of jerks, and it compounds it and makes them, you know what I'm saying? Like, and that exists everywhere. I think like every camp has their bad representatives that everyone remembers, and they don't remember all the good encounters, or maybe a lot of people gravitate towards the hostile, contentious discussions. And the reason they don't have any balance is because, I don't know, maybe subconsciously they want to go gravitate towards that. And there's plenty of people who can discuss these things in a, just an informative basis, not like getting all up in arms and jumping down each other's throats and stuff.
Yeah, I'm with you. Kevin, how have you been? I haven't been on this in a while.
I'm doing pretty good, thank you.
Good.
Just been keeping busy, as usual.
Yeah, it's challenging. I be starting my new job up soon, so that's pretty exciting.
Very cool.
Yeah, I sort of greet it with like a little bit of skepticism, a little bit of trepidation because I know what my path is, and I know what I have to do to get money. And it's like I just want to win the lottery, you know. Either win the lottery or win a free education somewhere.
Gotcha.
But that's why I'm doing my project. So.
Good, good. I'm glad. Just make sure to take a break every so often. You need to relax. You can't go all cylinders all the time.
Yeah, that's the issue. It's I haven't had much time to work on it because I'm always busy from everything else.
Yeah, makes sense.
Like today, I was planning on finishing reading the Marsden biography, and instead what ended up going through all my mail that had been piling up in the last 2 weeks.
Gotcha.
Anything new and exciting going on in your life?
Well, I've been keeping up with the volunteering. I've become a real asset. I've been able to help out. I was talking earlier before we started a little bit into it. My managers are not very tech savvy, and they were trying to relabel all the bookshelves, and they were just tinkering with a document file. Just didn't know anything on what they were doing. So I took it from them and I typed up all the labels, a brand new document file for them, so they can print out all the new labels whenever they need to. So if one gets torn, like some kid goes by and tears off one of them or something, they can just replace it. And I made sure to match the text to them. It was either Aaroni or Verdana, I think, for the kids section, and it was Times New Roman 72 font. For the adult section, so I'm usually pretty good at spotting text. I've done a lot of documents over the years and made blogs and articles and stuff, so it ended up looking really good. They were very happy. My manager's going to get me coffee a day after tomorrow when I come in, so
yeah.
It's nice. It takes the burden off of them because it's a volunteer organization. A lot of the people who work there, particularly in management, they're older. They're either retirees or they're doing it for a little extra stuff to do, or they're housewives who don't really have a whole lot going on. So, And she even told me when I first started working that they were glad to have another guy, because there doesn't tend to be a lot of guys who go out and do volunteering, which I think is a shame.
It is a shame. One of the things I noticed when I started volunteering over at the Ephrata Cloister, I would like to volunteer more often, but it's challenging when their hours are your working hours, and the weekends are always booked. I'm still looking for that 10 to 3 job. 10 to 3. I think that would be the ideal schedule for me.
Cool.
This is
What's
on
our-
the night out.
No, I totally get you. I totally get you. I was just going to say that this organization, they only allow you to volunteer once a week for a couple of hours. So they give other people opportunities to volunteer. I think it's technically possible to work like maybe 2 times a week, though it's not really needed. There's 2 different little library gift shops because there's 2 libraries in my city, and they're all affiliated with the same organization. So, Friends of the Library. So they do really good work, and they sell back donated books, and it helps to fund the library. So you get a lot of people getting accounts and stuff.
That's great. So up in my area I grew up, the library was sort of like this out-of-the-way place that nobody visited. And I come up down here to Ephrata, and the library's packed with people. They've got computers, they've got D&D club, they've got everything that you would expect to see in like a college extracurricular activities they have at the library. And I'm like, this is crazy, but I think that's great. It's a healthy library. I've never seen that one.
Yeah, they have a computer lab in the library that I'm at. It's actually kind of in the corner of an outdoor mall in my city. It's really located in a very good place, like around 2 freeways. So it gets a lot of activity. A lot of people come in who live in the city, and even people who come out of city, they go in for, like, they have Children's Day. Like, they'll have like little things kids can do. Like a couple months ago, they had a thing where kids kind of come in late towards the end of the library being open, and they dress up in pajamas and they get story time. It was actually really cool. They had people come in and read books to the kids, and they get like a little bit of candy and stuff like that, and prizes and stuff. And the computer lab's always full. It's always got people doing stuff. They teach classes there, little things like computer science type stuff. They have some printers in there, so they do a really good service for the general public. And we don't usually get crazies in there, but they did say to me it's good to have a few more guys working in the library and the gift store, because you do get the weird guy who walks in, he sees guys in there, he's going to walk out. But a few of the older ladies have felt a little scared a few times of people walking off the street, because you can just kind of walk into the mall area, and nothing serious has happened. There's not been any emergencies, but there's been a few close calls where you're not really sure what the guy's on or doing or whatever. But it's a really good neighborhood, and we have a lot of regulars who come in. Like, there's this one guy, he goes to both of the library gift stores, and he looks for comic books. And he's like forming collections. He'll go into both of them, and he'll come back a couple hours later and pick up another few. He'll like research things on his phone. So he buys a lot of comics from us. We have a few older ladies who go and they buy bestsellers. Like, we have a lot of bestsellers in there that get donated. Books that are almost brand new in a lot of cases. So there's quite a bit in there, and lots of kids' books. We have little seats in there, so mom can come over to their kids. They can take a seat down in the little kids section over there and do that. We also have CDs and a few things. So it's a nice job, and it helps out a lot of people, because I mean, if you can get a CD for $1, like a classic CD, or you can get kids' books for 25 cents, helps out a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. That's great.
And it's definitely up my alley because I read a lot, and I'm trying to read more. So, so I've been able to recommend
challenge
things
right now
for
is All right. Well, it's 1:09 a.m. on the East Coast, so I have to go to sleep so I can go to work tomorrow. Although I did get a call this evening saying that the electricity was out at my workplace this evening, so I'm gonna hope that it just stays out and that it's told that I don't have to come in until like noon. So
Gotcha. All right then. Well, thanks for coming in. I'm
I
glad
hope
you
I
got to have a
hope.
nice conversation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And sorry I came in so late.
Nah, no problems. You came at a good time. You got to talk to Jude, so
Mm.
both had an interesting discourse.
Oh yeah, definitely. All right. Good night.
Take care.